The life of a medieval peasant is often imagined as endless, monotonous, and hard work. However, if we look closely, we see that this life was filled with a variety of activities that depended on the season, the day of the week, and even the time of day. It was closely connected with nature and its cycles. Their daily routine was determined not by the clock but by the sun. Work began at dawn and ended at sunset. It was a life full of routine, but at the same time requiring constant ingenuity and resourcefulness. They did not just survive, but created a world around them that was self-sufficient and functional. From building houses to making clothes, from gathering food to protecting their fields, everything was part of their daily life. Watch the video to the end to find out how they were able to clear fields, make ropes, and treat wounds without modern tools. Most of the tools used by medieval peasants were made by themselves. The use of iron was a luxury. Therefore, wood, horns, and bones were used. Wood was used to make handles for plows, shovel handles, and rakes. Hammers and wedges were carved from hard wood such as oak or ash. The bones of large animals, such as cows or deer, were used to make sewing needles and tools for working with leather. Horns were used to make small shovels and scrapers needed for working with clay and other materials. The manufacture of each tool was painstaking work that required skill and patience. They knew how to choose the right material, dry it so that it would not crack, and shape it into the desired form. Every detail was made with its future purpose in mind, so that the tool would be not only functional, but also durable. Despite their simplicity, such tools served their owners faithfully for many years. How durable and effective do you think these homemade tools were compared to modern ones? In addition, tool making was part of the culture and traditions. Craftsmen passed on their knowledge from generation to generation, teaching newcomers all the intricacies of working with different materials. For example, to work with wood, they used not only axes, but also knives and special scrapers that helped to shape the workpiece. They took into account the direction of the fibers to make the tool as strong as possible. To do this, they chose wood that grew in a certain direction and dried it in the shade so that it would not crack. Special attention was paid to bones and horns. These materials were not simply selected, but processed in a special way. Bones were boiled to remove any remaining flesh, then polished to make them smooth. This made them ideal for making needles, awls, and tools for working leather. Needles were made from thin, sharp bones, and awls from thicker ones. Horns were used to make larger tools such as clay scrapers and hammer handles. This was very important because in the absence of metal, these materials were the only resources available. Many of these tools were multifunctional. For example, the same knife could be used for woodworking, leatherworking, and even cutting meat. This was because farmers could not afford to have many different tools, so they had to be versatile. They also used various stones to sharpen their tools, which was a very important process. The sharpening stone had to be hard enough to sharpen the tool, but not too hard to damage it. It was a real art. Their tools were not only functional, but also beautiful. Many of them were decorated with carvings, which were not only decorative, but also served to improve grip. This was especially important for tools used for heavy work. Such decorations could also be a kind of symbol of belonging to a particular community or clan. Thus, these tools were not just everyday objects, but works of art that reflected the culture and traditions of their people. But what if these tools were needed not only for work, but also to make edible plants come to you? The answer is coming soon. The work of a peasant was not limited to the field. The wild forests and fields around the village were a source of additional resources for them. Peasants knew very well which plants were edible and which were not. They gathered wild berries such as blackberries, raspberries, and strawberries, which served as an important addition to their diet. They also gathered forest nuts and acorns. Acorns, by the way, were not eaten raw because of their bitter taste, but after processing, the peasants obtained flour for baking. To do this, they were soaked in water to remove tannins. The forest also provided them with wild herbs, which they used not only for food, but also as medicine. The bark and leaves of some plants helped with colds, while decoctions from others helped with pain. This was not just gathering, but a real science passed down from generation to generation. Knowledge of plants was one of the key elements of survival. Thanks to this, they were able not only to diversify their meager diet, but also to maintain their health without access to pharmacies or doctors. This gathering practice was not chaotic, but very systematic. Peasants followed a strict calendar that was known to every member of the community. In the spring, they gathered young shoots and leaves, which they added to their food to replenish their vitamin reserves after the long winter. In summer, they gathered berries and herbs that could be dried and stored. Autumn was the time for gathering nuts, mushrooms, and roots. They also knew exactly where certain plants grew. For example, wild onions and garlic could be found on the edges of forests, and medicinal herbs in wet meadows. This knowledge was part of oral folklore and was passed down from older to younger generations. The medicinal properties of plants were known to everyone. To treat wounds, peasants used remedies provided by nature. For example, decoctions and infusions of oak bark, which is rich in tannins, were used to disinfect wounds. Crushed plantain leaves, which have antiseptic and hemostatic properties, were often applied to wounds. Compresses made from comfrey roots were used to reduce inflammation and relieve pain. Of course, such methods were not always as effective as modern medicine, but they helped to avoid infections, which were the main cause of death from wounds at that time. They also used plants to protect their fields from pests. For example, they planted garlic between rows to repel certain insects. It was a kind of organic farming. In addition to gathering, the peasants also engaged in harvesting. They dried herbs and berries to have supplies for the winter. To do this, they hung them under the roofs of their houses, where they were well ventilated. This allowed them to store food for a long time without fear of it spoiling. Thus, the forest was not just a place to walk, but a real supermarket where you could find everything you needed for life. This was very important because in conditions where access to shops was limited, peasants had to be completely self-sufficient. Protecting crops and vegetable gardens was one of the peasants' constant concerns. To do this, they built wicker fences. The process was relatively simple but required a lot of time and material. Peasants gathered flexible branches of willow, hazel, or other shrubs. Then they drove vertical stakes into the ground and intertwined the branches between them, creating a dense and sturdy barrier. Such fences not only protected the fields, but also served as a boundary between plots. The process was laborious, but did not require any complex tools, only an axe and a knife. The branches for weaving were harvested in advance so that they had time to dry out a little and become more durable. Building a fence was a collective effort involving the entire community, as the future harvest depended on its strength. What was more important to a farmer, a sturdy plow or a good fence? Building a fence was not just routine work, but a real art. Peasants had to not only know how to properly collect and prepare branches, but also how to weave them together. To do this, they used various weaving techniques that made the fence more durable and stable. For example, they used thicker branches to create the base and thinner ones to fill in the gaps. This allowed them to create a dense fence that was impassable for animals. They also knew how to install the stakes correctly. The stakes had to be driven into the ground deep enough to withstand the pressure. If the stakes were installed incorrectly, the fence could collapse and all the work would be in vain. Preparing materials for fences was seasonal work. Branches for weaving were harvested in early spring or late autumn when they were most flexible. Wood for stakes was harvested in winter when trees were less susceptible to disease. This was very important because with limited access to stores, farmers had to be completely self-sufficient. They also knew how to store materials. Branches for weaving were kept in a dry place so they would not rot, and stakes were kept in the ground so they would not crack. This was a form of storage that allowed them to have reserves for the future. Building a fence was an important social event. The entire community would gather to help each other. While some gathered materials, others set up the stakes, and still others wove the fence. It was a kind of collective creativity that brought people together and made them more united. Destroying a fence was a serious crime. If someone destroyed someone else's fence, they faced severe punishment. This was because a fence was not just a barrier, but a symbol of ownership and community. Destroying a fence meant not only losing the harvest, but also destroying social ties. Therefore, every farmer had to take care of his fence and keep it in good condition. If a fence was damaged, it had to be repaired immediately so that the harvest would not be affected. Wicker fences were not only protection from animals, but also from people. They served as a boundary between plots of land and prevented disputes. If someone crossed someone else's fence without permission, they would be punished. It was a kind of law that regulated relations between peasants. Thus, the fence was not only a physical barrier, but also a social one. It was a symbol of order and justice. But what if, to create something truly important, they did not need a plow or a fence, but only what could be found right under their feet? Want to know the answer to this question? Keep watching the video. Making ropes and cords was an important part of peasant life. Ropes were necessary for many purposes, for tying sheaves, lifting loads, and repairing buildings. Peasants used plant fibers such as nettles or flax for this purpose. First, they collected the stems, then soaked them to separate the fibers. This process was called retting. After that, the fibers were dried and twisted to create strong threads. The threads were woven into ropes of different thicknesses, depending on their intended use. Ropes made from nettle fibers were particularly strong and were used where high reliability was required. The manufacture of ropes was manual labor, which took a lot of time but was vital. Ropes were woven from thicker fibers or several thin ropes, which made them even stronger. This process required skill and patience, but allowed peasants to be completely self-sufficient in this regard. Nettle was one of the most popular materials for making ropes. Its fibers were very strong and resistant to decay. To obtain the fibers, nettles were harvested while still green and then soaked in water for several weeks. During this time, the stems decomposed and the fibers could be easily separated. The fibers were then dried and twisted into threads. This process was labor-intensive, but the result was worth it. Flax was another popular material. Its fibers were finer and softer, so they were used to make thinner ropes, which were used for sewing and other more delicate work. The process of making ropes from flax was similar to that of making ropes from nettles, but required more care. Flax was also soaked, but for a shorter period of time, as its fibers were more susceptible to rotting. After that, the fibers were dried and twisted into threads. Ropes were woven from several strands. For this, they used special looms that allowed them to weave ropes of different thicknesses. Ropes were used for heavier work, such as lifting loads or repairing buildings. They were very strong and could withstand heavy weights. Rope making was a collective endeavor in which the entire community participated. It was a kind of collective creativity that brought people together and made them more united. Making ropes was not only routine work, but also a kind of creativity. The peasants experimented with different materials and techniques to make stronger and more durable ropes. They used various plants such as hemp, linden, and even willow twigs. It was a kind of scientific research that allowed them to create more sophisticated tools. Rope making was a very important process that was vital for survival. Without ropes, farmers would not have been able to perform many of their daily tasks. They would not have been able to tie sheaves, lift loads, or repair buildings. Therefore, rope making was one of the most important activities in their lives. It was a kind of investment in the future, as a good rope ensured a good harvest and prosperity. During seasonal work, especially during harvest time, peasants spent most of their day in the fields. To protect themselves from the sun or unexpected rain, they built temporary shelters. These structures were very simple: a few stakes driven into the ground and a roof woven from straw, branches, or large leaves. These shelters were not intended for permanent habitation, but provided good protection from the weather and allowed people to rest in the shade. They were easy to erect and just as easy to dismantle. Such temporary structures were necessary when the fields were far from the village, and it was impractical to return there. They allowed peasants to work more efficiently without wasting time on long journeys. How long do you think it took to build such a shelter? Building such a shelter was a collective effort. Usually, several people would gather to help each other. While some gathered branches and straw, others set up the stakes. This was very important because in conditions where it was necessary to work quickly, collective labor was the only way to accomplish the task. These shelters were not only protection from the weather, but also a place to rest. In them, the peasants could have lunch, take a break from the scorching sun, and gather strength for further work. They also used them to store tools and food. This was very important because when the fields were far from the village, it was impractical to return there. They also used these shelters for overnight stays. If work in the fields dragged on, they would stay there overnight so as not to waste time on long journeys. This was very important because it allowed them to work more efficiently. Building shelters was a kind of art. Peasants experimented with different materials and techniques to make more durable and long-lasting shelters. They used different types of branches and straw to make the roof waterproof. They also used various stones and clay to strengthen the walls. It was a kind of scientific research that allowed them to create more sophisticated shelters. In addition to shelters, farmers also built small sheds. These sheds were used to store tools and food. They were very simple: a few stakes driven into the ground and a roof made of branches and straw. These sheds were very important because they allowed farmers to keep their tools and food dry. This was very important because in conditions where access to shops was limited, farmers had to be completely self-sufficient. The construction of these shelters and sheds was a kind of ritual. At the beginning of each season, the farmers would gather together to build them. It was a kind of celebration that brought people together and made them more united. At the end of the season, they would dismantle them to use the materials for other purposes. This was very important because it allowed them to save resources. These shelters and sheds were not only protection, but also a place for communication. In them, peasants could share news, discuss problems, and simply socialize. This was very important because in conditions where life was hard, communication was the only way to cope with difficulties. Temporary shelters were a testament to the ingenuity and practicality of the peasants. They did not waste time and energy on building permanent structures, understanding that their main task was working in the fields. Their design was thought out down to the smallest detail. The stakes were sharpened to make them easier to drive into the ground, and branches and straw for the roof were gathered in advance. All this was done to minimize the time and effort that could be spent on more important things. But what if I told you that the most important building material for them was completely free and could simply be dug out from under their feet? Surprised? Keep watching this video and you'll learn their secret. Clay was one of the most accessible and versatile materials. It was used to build walls, coat wooden structures to protect them from fire, make dishes, and even mold toys. To build walls, clay was mixed with straw and water to create a durable and insulating material. This method was common in areas where there was not much stone or wood. Clay was also used to make simple pots and bowls for storing food and cooking. These items were not fired in kilns, but simply dried in the sun, which made them fragile but perfectly suitable for everyday use. The ability to work with clay was an important skill that allowed peasants to create the things they needed for everyday life without having to buy them. Working with clay was a process that required in-depth knowledge of its properties. Peasants had to mix clay with straw in specific proportions. If there was too much clay, the walls could crack when drying, and if there was too little, they would not be strong enough. They also knew how to prepare the straw properly. The straw was chopped into small pieces so that it was evenly distributed in the clay. This made the material more durable and resistant to destruction. They also added sand to the clay so that it would not shrink as much when drying. Clay houses were not only strong but also warm. Clay was an excellent insulator that kept the heat in during winter and the coolness in during summer. This was very important because in conditions where access to fuel was limited, a warm house was a luxury. Peasants also coated the walls with clay to protect them from wind and rain. This made the house more durable and long-lasting. Clay coating was a kind of finish that made the house more beautiful. Making clay pots was an important part of everyday life. Peasants made pots, bowls, jugs, and even oven pots. They did not fire the pots in ovens, but simply dried them in the sun. This made them fragile, but perfectly suitable for everyday use. Clay was also used to make stoves. Stoves were an integral part of peasant life. They were used to cook food, heat the house, and dry grain. Stoves were made of clay mixed with straw and sand. This made them durable and heat insulating. Stoves were not only functional but also beautiful. Many of them were decorated with carvings, which were not only decorative but also served to provide a better grip. Bricks were also made from clay. Bricks were made from clay mixed with sand and straw, then dried in the sun. This made them strong and durable. Bricks were used to build walls and stoves. They were stronger than clay walls and more resistant to destruction. However, making bricks was a more labor-intensive process, so they were only used for the most important buildings. Clay was not only a building material, but also a medicine. It was used to treat wounds and burns. Clay had antiseptic properties and helped prevent infections. To do this, it was mixed with water to form a paste and applied to the wound. This was very important because in the absence of pharmacies and doctors, clay was the only available remedy. Fishing was an important supplement to agriculture, as it provided an additional source of protein. But metal hooks were expensive. Therefore, peasants made fishing gear from materials at hand. Hooks were carved from animal bones, and fishing lines were woven from nettle fibers or horsehair. Floats were made from bark or dried wood. Fishing rods were ordinary branches that they found in the forest. Sometimes they made traps out of woven branches, which they set in small streams. These traps were passive and allowed the peasants to catch fish while they were busy with other things. All these devices were simple but effective. The art of making fishing hooks from bone required incredible skill and patience. Peasants chose the hardest and straightest bones, usually from the legs of large animals such as cows or deer. Floats made from bark or wood were very simple but effective. Peasants cut them from pieces of wood or bark, then shaped them and drilled a hole to thread the fishing line through. Traps made of woven branches were very popular. They were made from flexible willow or hazel branches, which were woven into a cone shape. They placed bait inside the trap and then set it in a stream or river. Fish that swam inside could not escape. These traps were very effective and allowed farmers to catch fish while they were busy with other tasks. It was a kind of passive fishing method that saved them time. Fishing was not only a way to obtain food, but also a form of entertainment. Peasants enjoyed spending time by the water, socializing with each other, and enjoying nature. It was a kind of relaxation that allowed them to take a break from their hard work. Fishing was seasonal. In the spring, they fished in streams and rivers, and in the summer, they fished in lakes. In the winter, they fished under the ice. This was very important because it provided them with an additional source of food throughout the year. They also knew that different types of fish bite on different bait. For example, worms could be used to catch perch, and bread could be used to catch carp. The manufacture of fishing gear was a very important process that was vital for survival. Without it, peasants would not have been able to obtain an additional source of protein, which was very important for their health. Therefore, the manufacture of fishing gear was one of the most important tasks in their lives. It was a kind of investment in the future, as good fishing gear ensured a good catch and prosperity. Animals were an integral part of a farmer's life. Cows, pigs, and sheep provided them with milk, meat, wool, and hides. Caring for them was a daily responsibility. Caring for livestock required knowledge of animal diseases and how to treat them with herbs. Sheep wool was used to make clothing, and hides were used for shoes and various other items. It was hard but necessary work that provided the family with everything they needed. Caring for animals was a task that required constant attention. Peasants did not just graze their livestock, they monitored their health, nutrition, and safety. They knew which herbs were edible and which were not. They also knew how to treat animals with herbs. For example, they used oak bark decoction to treat colds in cows and crushed plantain leaves to treat wounds. This was very important because, in the absence of veterinarians, farmers were the only ones who could help animals. Caring for animals was a collective effort. The entire community would gather to help each other. While some tended to the livestock, others cleaned the pens. It was a kind of collective creativity that brought people closer together and made them more united. Caring for animals was not only a means of protection from the cold, but also a symbol of community and cooperation. Farmers worked together to create something that was important to everyone. Animals were not only a source of food and clothing, but also a source of labor. Cows were used to plow fields, and horses were used to transport goods. This was very important because in the absence of machines, animals were the only source of labor. Using animals for work was a kind of investment in the future, as they helped farmers get a good harvest. Caring for animals was part of the culture and traditions. Craftsmen passed on their knowledge from generation to generation, teaching newcomers all the intricacies of working with different animals. This was very important because it allowed them to be completely self-sufficient. Thus, these animals were not just everyday objects, but works of art that reflected the culture and traditions of their people. In this video, we took a detailed look at the diverse daily activities of medieval English peasants. Their lives were not limited to hard work in the fields. They were skilled craftsmen, from making tools out of bones to building houses out of clay. Their skills allowed them to survive and thrive in an environment where every resource was of great importance. We saw how they used natural materials to make ropes, how they built temporary shelters, and how they cared for livestock, which was not only a source of food, but also a source of labor. What did you find most difficult about the life of a medieval peasant? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new interesting videos.